I inherited $26 million. And just hours later, my own family left me homeless. This is the story of how I turned things around. I am Natalie Foster, 27 years old, a kindergarten teacher, and for most of my life, someone no one would ever expect to have a story worth listening to. I used to think of myself as background noise in a loud world, a soft voice in a classroom of children, a small apartment dweller who stretched every paycheck to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional library late fee. Life was steady, even if it was small, and I thought that was enough. But the truth is, the story you are about to hear didn't begin with me. It began with my grandparents, Harold and Elizabeth, who raised me more than my parents ever did. They were wealthy but unpretentious, pillars of quiet wisdom who never wore their fortune on their sleeves. To the world, they seemed like an elderly couple with a modest home and a garden. To me, they were the only people who ever made me feel like I belonged. My parents, Richard and Diane Foster, were always elsewhere, consumed by the pursuit of status and business opportunities. They gave me the basics of food and shelter, but never the tenderness of love. They showed up at school plays but stared into their phones. They paid for braces but never noticed the smile they helped straighten. My father's voice was stern, clipped, and transactional, as if every conversation was a contract negotiation. My mother's laughter was often loud but hollow, more for the benefit of her friends at country clubs than her daughter at home. My grandparents were different. They taught me that money was only a tool, not a measure of worth. Grandpa Harold used to kneel in the dirt with me, guiding my tiny hands as I planted tomato seeds in their backyard. These will grow if you care for them, he'd say, just like people. Grandma Elizabeth showed me how to sew a missing button and insisted on sitting front row at every soccer game, clapping louder than anyone else. They treated me not as an obligation, but as their legacy. And then one Tuesday evening, 6 weeks ago, my world collapsed. I was grading children's spelling tests when the phone rang. A police officer's voice, polite but unyielding, told me that my grandparents had been struck by a drunk driver running a red light. They died instantly. He said they didn't suffer, as though that I stood among them, numb, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to my grandparents' lawyer's office. I thought it was just formality, signatures, perhaps some token memento they had left me. But when I stepped into that oak paneled room and saw my entire family gathered, the air was already heavy with expectation. They all assumed the same thing, that Harold and Elizabeth's fortune would pass to Richard, their only son, or at least be divided among their bloodline like slices of pie. But what happened next would ignite the firestorm that became my life. The lawyer, Matthew Goldstein, cleared his throat and read aloud. We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including all cash assets, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and ownership in Alexander Logistics, valued at approximately $26 million, to our beloved granddaughter, Natalie Grace Foster. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's face drained of color, my mother gasped so loudly it echoed, Jason's fists clenched, and Aunt Pam's voice quivered with fury. And me? I could barely breathe. $26 million. I was a teacher making 35,000 a year, and suddenly I was heir to a fortune. That day, I should have felt blessed. But as I looked around the table at the glares and narrowed eyes of the people who shared my last name, I realized something chilling. I had not just inherited money, I had inherited enemies. And that is where my story truly begins, because what my family did next turned grief into betrayal, blood into battle, and my life into a storm of revenge, survival, and ultimately transformation. The night everything ended was not the funeral. It was not the awkward dinner afterward where my father ordered the cheapest wine on the menu but demanded the most expensive entree, or where my mother's eyes never left her phone as she scrolled through condolence messages like they were gossip. No. The night everything truly ended was the reading of the will, and the aftermath that followed me like a shadow. I remember the moment Matthew Goldstein, the lawyer, closed the leather portfolio and looked at me. His voice had been steady, matter of fact, but behind his glasses, I thought I saw a flicker of pity, as if he knew what those words would unleash. My father stood so fast his chair toppled backward. "This is ridiculous," he spat, grabbing the will from Matthew's hands. "They were manipulated, senile, this can't stand." My mother, Diane, pressed a manicured hand to her chest, as if offended on behalf of the family name. All this money to a kindergarten teacher. She wouldn't know the first thing about managing it. Jason slammed his palm on the table. "What about me? I need capital for my startup. This is insane." And then there was Aunt Pamela, leaning in with eyes like daggers. "What did you do, Natalie? What did you whisper into their ears to make them betray their own children?" I couldn't speak. I wanted to tell them that I had never asked my grandparents for a penny, that I hadn't even known the extent of their wealth, but my throat locked. All I could do was stare at the names and numbers on the paper in front of me, as though they were written in another language. That night, as I left the lawyer's office, my father grabbed my arm in the parking lot. His grip was like iron. "This discussion isn't over," he hissed. "You'll come to the house tonight, 6 o'clock, and you'll fix this mistake." The way he said it wasn't a request, it was a command. I drove home with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, the envelope of legal documents sitting heavy in the passenger seat. At every red light, I imagined what waited for me: accusations, demands, maybe even threats. I thought about calling Matthew, telling him I couldn't face them. But something in me, something I recognized from my grandfather's stubborn jaw, told me I had to go. When I arrived at my parents' mansion, the lights glared like floodlights at a prison yard. Inside, they were already waiting. My father by the fireplace, tumbler of scotch in hand. My mother perched on a stiff chair, her voice syrupy but sharp. Jason sprawled across the sofa, laptop open as though he were preparing contracts. Aunt Pamela pacing, Uncle Stephen by the window, silent as ever. My father wasted no time. "Here's how this is going to work. You sign over the estate to me as head of the family. You'll get 10%. That's more than generous for someone with your limited needs. 10% out of 26 million, over $2 million. And yet, the way he said it was as if he were offering me scraps, patting me on the head like a dog begging at the table. Jason jumped in. "More than enough for you. I need at least 5 million from my crypto exchange. It's going to revolutionize finance." Aunt Pamela chimed in, her voice trembling with mock righteousness. "The house should go to us. I have 3 children, Natalie. They deserve better schools, Don't you think your cousins deserve a future? Every word felt like a hammer against my skull, and still I sat silent, trying to absorb the absurdity of it all. My grandparents had trusted me, had looked me in the eye countless times, and told me that character mattered more than money. And now here was my so called family, slicing up their legs. My mother's eyes glittered with expectation. Jason's smirk grew. Aunt Pamela even clasped her hands together like she was about to be saved. And that was the moment. The moment the teacher, the quiet background character, had to decide whether she would fold or fight. I put the pen down. No, I whispered. The silence was deafening. What did you just say? My father growled. I said no. I won't sign this. I won't dishonor grandma and grandpa like that. The explosion was instant. My mother shrieked about ingratitude. Jason called me names I won't repeat. Pamela wailed about her children's future. Through it all, my father loomed over me, pointing his finger inches from my face. You have a choice, Natalie. Either you sign that paper and stay part of this family, or you take the money and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both. My chest tightened. I searched their faces for love, for anything human, but found only hunger. Hunger for wealth, for control, for a legacy they had never earned. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had never really belonged to this family. I had been tolerated, maybe even used, but loved? Never. So I stood up, the paper sliding from my hand to the floor. Then I choose them, I said softly. I choose Grandma and Grandpa. My father's face twisted. Get out, he snarled. Get out and don't come back. I left their house with 3 bags and nowhere to go. As I stood on the driveway under the cold night sky, I understood what had just happened. I had lost the only home I'd known, the last thread connecting me to them. But I had also taken the first step. And sometimes the first step into hell is the only path to heaven. I used to believe family was unshakable, like the walls of a house you could always return to. But after that night, I realized my family was more like a house built on sand, polished on the outside, rotten at the core. When I think back, the signs were always there. My father, Richard Foster, was the type of man who measured worth in numbers and power. As a child, I watched him pace the living room with his phone glued to his ear, barking orders, dismissing people as if they were pawns on a chessboard. He worked 60-hour weeks, not out of necessity, but out of addiction, addiction to climbing higher, to proving he deserved a seat above everyone else. Yet in his pursuit of prestige, he left behind the one thing he was supposed to protect, his family. My mother, Diane, lived in. He jumped from scheme to scheme: an app for rating public bathrooms, a podcast about success without work, a cryptocurrency platform that promised riches but never left the ground. He was always on the verge of greatness, at least in his own mind, and every failure was just another excuse to demand money from my parents, or worse, from my grandparents. But if Jason was the opportunist, Aunt Pamela was the actor. She could turn tears on like a faucet. She cried at every family gathering, though never enough to smudge her makeup. Her husband, Uncle Stephen, was her shadow, nodding when she spoke, vanishing when she raged. Together they were leeches, draining time, attention, and resources from anyone gullible enough to offer. Looking back, I see how each of them circled my grandparents like vultures waiting for a weakness. Grandpa Harold and Grandma Elizabeth had lived frugally, yes, but they had also built Alexander Logistics into a regional powerhouse. One truck in the 1970s became 200 by the time I was born. 5 warehouses stretched across 3 states. They never flaunted it, but everyone in the family knew the empire they had created, and everyone assumed one day that empire would be theirs. Everyone except me. I never wanted the empire. I wanted the Sunday dinners at their modest 4 bedroom home. I wanted the afternoons spent in the garden, dirt under my fingernails, Grandpa's laughter filling the air. I wanted the smell of Grandma's cookies cooling on the counter while she hummed old songs I didn't recognize. Those were my inheritance. Those were the treasures I thought they'd leave behind. And yet, when the will was read, the family I thought I knew revealed themselves. My father, livid not because his parents had died, but because his payday had vanished. My mother, insulted that her daughter, a mere school teacher, was now richer than her entire circle of friends. Jason, outraged that his next big thing wouldn't be funded by someone else's wallet. Pamela, clutching her pearls at the injustice of being cut out, as though she had ever lifted a finger to care for her parents. I replay that scene in Matthew Goldstein's office over and over. The shock, the fury, the accusations. But what haunts me most isn't their anger, it's how natural it felt to them. As if cruelty were their default language. As if betrayal were inevitable. That night, when they forced me to their mansion and shoved papers in my face, I thought the betrayal had peaked. But I was wrong. That was just the opening act. The real betrayal came later, in quieter moments. The eviction notice slipped under my apartment door, signed not by a stranger, but by my own father, who had hidden his ownership of the building behind a shell company. The text messages from Jason, mocking me, daring me to survive one night without their help. The bridges burn, and I stood in the ashes, watching the only people who were supposed to protect me sharpen their knives instead. But here's the thing about betrayal. It clarifies. It strips away illusions. And once the illusions are gone, you can finally see the truth. I saw my family for what they were, not guardians of legacy, not protectors of blood, but predators. Wolves wearing the names of mother, father, brother, aunt. And I made myself a promise. If they wanted a war, then a war they would get. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just a teacher. But they had forgotten something my grandparents knew all along. They had forgotten who raised me. I didn't think it was possible to hit rock bottom when you've just inherited $26 million. But I learned quickly that money on paper means nothing when everyone you know wants to rip it out of your hands. When the people who raised you throw you into the street with nothing but a duffel bag and a quilt your grandmother once sewed. That night, after refusing to sign away my grandparents' legacy, I drove back to my apartment with trembling hands. The building looked the same, the neon lights flickering, the quiet hum of late-night traffic in the distance. I wanted the comfort of my small, second-hand couch, the stack of library books waiting by my bed, but when I reached my door, I found a thick white envelope taped across it. My stomach dropped. It was an eviction notice. effective immediately, signed by a property management company I'd never heard of. And in the corner, in faint legal language, was the revelation. The company was owned by a holding group under my father's control. He hadn't lied. He had been my landlord all along. I slid down the hallway wall, clutching the notice as the reality crushed me. I was homeless, a millionaire on paper, but homeless in reality. And worse, I realized this was exactly the point. My family wanted me cornered, desperate, weak. They wanted me to come crawling back, to beg for mercy, so they could dictate the terms of my surrender. I refused. Still, the hours that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I threw what little I could into my car: clothes, a toothbrush, the quilt, my laptop, and drove aimlessly through the city. Gas stations, empty parking lots. Because it wasn't just that I had lost my grandparents. It was that I had finally lost the illusion that my parents cared about me at all. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke, the early morning sun was streaking through the car windows. My phone buzzed with notifications, messages from Jason. You think you're rich, but you've got nothing. Bet you didn't know Dad owns your lease. Good luck, sis. Enjoy your fancy car bed. Each text was another knife twisting deeper. My hands trembled as I typed a reply, but then I stopped. No. Responding would give him power, and that was something I couldn't afford. Later that morning, I drove past my grandparents' home. Their garden was still in bloom, untouched by tragedy. The porch light was still on, probably on a timer Grandpa had set years ago. I sat in the driveway, staring at the front door, the key Matthew had given me heavy in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Not yet. The memory of their laughter still lingered too strongly. Entering without them felt like trespassing on sacred ground. So instead, I parked at a diner nearby. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee mixed with the chatter of strangers. I slid into a booth and ordered nothing but a cup of tea. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed my red, swollen face and asked if I was all right. I almost told her everything, but how could I? How could I say, my family just disowned me for $26 million? It sounded like fiction, so I lied. Just a rough night. She gave me a refill on the house. That small kindness nearly broke me all over again. By the time I left the diner, I had made a vow. If my family wanted me to break, they would be disappointed. If they thought they could corner me, they would learn otherwise. I would not fold. I would not be bullied into surrender. But I also knew I couldn't fight them as I was, weak, alone, homeless. If I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to honor my grandparents, I had to transform, and that meant embracing something I had always avoided: the fire inside me, the stubborn steel I had inherited, not from my parents, but from Harold and Elizabeth. I drove away from that diner, not as the same Natalie who had been humiliated and cast aside. No, that girl was gone. In her place was someone new, someone ready to fight back. But first, I had to learn how. The first days after being cast out of my family's home felt like wandering through fog, each step uncertain, each breath heavy with disbelief. But beneath the grief, something began to shift in playing chess with Grandpa on Friday nights and sharing recipes with Grandma. When I walked into his office, Still clutching the eviction notice like it was a death sentence, he looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and pride. You feel lost, he said softly, but Harold and Elizabeth prepared you for this more than you realize. They knew your father, they knew Pamela, they knew the wolves you're facing, and they didn't leave you defenseless. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, property deeds, trust accounts, instructions, meticulously written by my grandparents. I wasn't just their heir, I was their chosen steward. They had anticipated my family's greed and had quietly built safeguards. A small cottage property in my name, untouched by my father's reach, accounts managed by advisors who had sworn loyalty to Harold and Elizabeth, not to bloodline politics. Still, preparation on paper wasn't enough. I needed strength, I needed knowledge. So I began to learn. Matthew introduced me to Rosa Martinez, my grandparents' former business partner at Alexander Logistics. Rosa was sharp, confident, and relentless. She agreed to mentor me, not out of obligation, but out of respect for Harold and Elizabeth. If you're going to protect what they built, she told me, you need to understand it. Numbers, contracts, the language of power. Our sessions were brutal. She handed me financial reports thicker than textbooks and expected me to decipher them. She quizzed me on logistics routes, profit margins, union contracts. At first, I stumbled, my teacher's mind overwhelmed by the flood of business jargon. But gradually, I found rhythm. Just as I had once guided children through spelling tests, Rosa guided me through the maze of commerce. You have your grandfather's patience, she said one evening, after I successfully explained a balance sheet back to her. And your grandmother's tenacity. Don't forget that. Parallel to my financial training, Matthew worked with me on the legal front. He showed me case law, explained the intricacies of probate courts, and prepared me for the inevitable contest my family would launch. He was calm, but firm, reminding me at every turn that documentation was my shield. They will try to paint you as unfit. They will dig into your life, your choices, even your mistakes. We counter them with evidence, evidence they can't refute. And then there was Carlos Ramirez, the estate manager who had cared for my grandparents' property for years. He became my anchor in the storm. With his quiet loyalty, he reminded me of Grandpa. Steady hands, honest eyes, a presence, but a woman who understood the weight of legacy, the cost of betrayal, and the necessity of strength. Still, transformation doesn't come without fire. One evening, exhausted from studying, I returned to the cottage property my grandparents had secretly left me. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a rush of warmth. It smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish, like Grandma had just cleaned. On the dresser, I found a box with my name on it. Inside were journals, my grandmother's handwriting filling page after page. I sat cross-legged on the floor, reeling entries that stretched back years. Each page was a record of their disappointment with my father, their heartbreak over Pamela's manipulations, their cautious hope for me, over and over. One line repeated, Natalie sees us. She cares for us without expectation. She is our true legacy. I cried until my throat was raw, not because of the pain, but because of the clarity. My grandparents hadn't left me the fortune by accident. They had chosen me deliberately, intentionally, because they believed in me. And for the first time, I began to believe in myself. The next morning, I woke with resolve. If my family wanted to drag me into court, I would face them. If they wanted to paint me as weak, I would show them strength. If they wanted war, I would give them one. but not with fists or fury, with patience, with evidence, with the very values my grandparents had instilled in me. Because revenge, I realized, wasn't about destroying them, it was about surviving them. It was about standing tall when they expected me to kneel. And I wasn't going to kneel. Not anymore. That was the day Natalie Foster began her transformation. That was the day the teacher became something more. I kept my head low in the weeks that followed. To the outside world, I was just another teacher grieving the loss of our grandparents. To my family, I was silent, unreachable, which only made them angrier. But in truth, I was building something they could not see. My return would not be loud. It would be quiet, deliberate, like a seed breaking the soil before anyone realizes a tree is coming. I began moving in secret. The cottage my grandparents had left me became both refuge and fortress. Carlos helped reinforce the doors and update the locks, while Rosa walked me through setting up encrypted accounts for financial transfers. Matthew handled the legal filings, discreetly moving assets into structures my father couldn't touch. On the surface, I was still the teacher with second-hand clothes and a modest car. But beneath that facade, I was becoming the executor of a strategy my grandparents had begun years earlier. The real treasure wasn't the money, it was the paper trail. One evening, Carlos brought in a worn leather box from the main house. Your grandmother wanted you to have this when the time was right, he said. Inside were journals, decades of entries in her lupin elegant script. Every loan request from my father, every snide comment from Pamela, it was all there, documented like a living ledger of betrayal. And there was more. Hidden in a false drawer of my grandfather's desk, Carlos found USB drives containing video footage. My father and Jason rifling through drawers after the funeral, Pamela pocketing jewelry before the burial reception had even ended. Cold, undeniable proof of their greed. For hours, I sat in the dim glow of the study lamp, watching the footage and reading the words of people I loved more than life. Each sentence was a blade, but instead of cutting me down, it carved me into something sharper. My grandparents hadn't just left me their fortune, they had left me their receipts, evidence, weapons. I didn't want war, but they had left me no choice. And now, finally, I had the ammunition. Still, I couldn't win alone. That's when I discovered just how deep my grandparents' foresight went. Rosa introduced me to George Patel, the family's longtime investment advisor, who revealed a surprising truth. My grandparents had intentionally restructured the company's shares to ensure that any attempt by Richard to seize control would backfire. They trusted you to protect their values, he told me. Profit sharing for employees, ethical contracts, integrity, it's all built into the bylaws. If your father tries to change it, he exposes his own history of embezzlement attempts. My jaw dropped. You mean they knew this was coming? Of course, George said. Harold and Elizabeth weren't naive. They prepared for this moment, Natalie. They prepared for you. And then came the twist I never expected. Dorothy, the long-time housekeeper, pulled me aside one morning and handed me an envelope. Your grandmother made me promise, she whispered. Inside was a sealed letter in Elizabeth's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Natalie, it read, if you are reading this, then the family has already shown their true colors. Remember, you do not fight alone. We built not just a business, but a community. They will stand with you when blood does not. Trust them. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. For so long I had felt alone, like a lamb among wolves. But my grandparents had seen this storm coming, and they had built a network around me strong enough to withstand it. I reached out to that community quietly. Former employees, neighbors, friends who had known Harold and Elizabeth for decades. To my astonishment, they didn't just offer sympathy, they offered testimony. They told me stories of loans Richard never repaid, of tantrums Pamela threw, of Jason's scams that cost innocent people thousands. Piece by piece, a puzzle formed, a puzzle that revealed exactly who my family was when no one was watching. As the evidence mounted, so did my resolve. I was going to fight like my grandparents had taught me, with patience, precision, and principle. So I stayed quiet. To my family, I remained the silent teacher, the girl too overwhelmed to know what to do. But behind the curtain, I was gathering allies, documents, and a plan. And when the time came, I would return to that house, the house where they had tried to break me, and I would draw a line they could never cross again. That return would not be loud, it would not be desperate, it would be devastating. The night before I went back to my grandparents' house, I barely slept. I lay in the guest room of the cottage, staring at the ceiling while my grandmother's quilt wrapped around me like armor. My heart beat too fast. My mind replayed every insult, every threat, every smirk from my father, my mother, my brother. But beneath the fear was something sharper, something steadier. Resolve. By morning, the plan was set. Matthew arrived first, briefcase in hand, his silver hair combed neatly as always. He brought restraining orders, cease and desist letters, and affidavits signed by the people who had seen my family at their worst. Behind him came Rosa, laptop under her arm, ready to present company records that revealed Richard's unpaid loans and forged attempts at control. Then George, the financial advisor, who carried years of investment logs proving my grandparents' clarity of mind. Dorothy bustled in with breakfast, bacon, eggs, coffee, and insisted everyone eat, as if preparing soldiers for battle. And finally Carlos, steady as a stone, stationed himself by the door like a quiet sentinel. We weren't just a group, we were a war. At exactly 10 o'clock, the driveway filled. First my father's black sedan, gleaming like a predator, then my mother's white SUV, Pamela and Stephen's convertible, Jason's impractical sports car. They stepped out one by one, dressed as though they were arriving at a gala rather than a confrontation. Jason even wore sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. They didn't knock, they pounded. When Carlos opened the door, my father shoved past him, barking, "Where's Natalie? We're here to take what belongs to us." I stepped into the foyer, my heart hammering, but my voice steady. "It doesn't belong to you, not anymore." The living room became the stage, my family clustered together, radiating arrogance and anger. Behind me stood Matthew, Rosa, George, Dorothy, and Carlos, a strange, chosen family of witnesses and protectors. "What is this circus?" my mother sneered. He remembered the last time Judge Henderson had ruled against him, exposing his lies in court. "This isn't a surprise," the judge said coldly. "Your parents asked me to witness any disputes after their passing, and here I am." The tension was suffocating. My family's bravado began to falter under the weight of so many eyes. For the first time, the power was shifting. I moved to the center of the room. "You've all accused me of manipulation, of theft, of betrayal, but today the truth speaks louder than your lies." Rosa opened her laptop and displayed the records. Unpaid loans, unauthorized transfers, forged documents Richard had tried to slip through years ago. George presented medical evaluations proving my grandparents' mental sharpness at the time of the will. Dorothy handed over journals filled with Elizabeth's careful notes of every cruel remark, every demand, every betrayal. And then came the footage. Jason pocketing electronics after the funeral. Pamela slipping jewelry into her purse. My father's face reddened. Jason cursed under his breath. Pamela gasped, then snarled at me. You set us up. No, I said, my voice shaking but firm. You set yourselves up. Grandma and Grandpa knew who you were. They knew what you would do, and they prepared for it. My father slammed his hand on the table. This doesn't change anything. That fortune belongs to the family, to me. Judge Henderson's voice cut like steel. It belongs to who Harold and Elizabeth chose. And they chose Natalie. Legally, morally, absolutely. For a moment, the room was silent. And then my father's mask cracked. He pointed at me, his hand trembling with rage. You think you've won? You're nothing without us. You're still that pathetic little girl begging for scraps at the dinner table. And no court, no lawyer, no judge will change that. I felt the old fear stir, but then, stronger, came another memory. My grandfather's voice. No one can take your dignity unless you give it away. I stepped closer to my father until his furious eyes locked with mine. I'm not begging anymore, I said quietly. I'm standing, flipping through with shaking hands. His face blanched as he read page after page. Copies of forged checks, records of attempted withdrawals, a documented attempt to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent just a year earlier. Jason laughed nervously. Come on, this is taken out of context. Rosa snapped her laptop shut with a sharp click. The only context is greed, and it's all documented. But it wasn't over. Not yet. I reached into the envelope Matthew had given me weeks earlier and pulled out a flash drive. My hands shook slightly, but my voice was clear. There's more. My grandparents recorded everything. Not just numbers, not just accounts, their voices, their words. I inserted the drive into Rosa's laptop. A video filled the screen. There they were, Grandpa Harold and Grandma Elizabeth, sitting side by side on their worn floral sofa, their hands clasped. My chest tightened at the sight. If you are watching this, Grandpa began, his voice steady but gentle, it means we have passed, and it also means the family we loved may be tearing itself apart. Grandma leaned forward. Richard, Pamela, we love you. But love cannot blind us to the truth. You've treated us as a resource to be mined, not as parents to be cherished. Every loan request, every insult about our modest life, every absence at milestones, it all showed us who you became, and it broke our hearts. Pamela gasped, her face pale. My mother shifted uncomfortably. Jason muttered, "This is manipulative nonsense." But the video continued. "We built our business not for riches, but for values. Hard work, honesty, fairness. Natalie is the only one who has shown those values consistently. She chose to live simply. She chose a career of service. She visited us not to gain but to give. That is why she inherits. That is why she is our legacy." Grandma's voice softened. "We know you'll say this isn't fair, but fairness isn't giving everyone the same. Fairness is giving to those who have given in return. Natalie gave us love when no one else would. She is the future we trust." The screen went black. The silence afterward was more powerful than any shouting. My father's jaw clenched, his fists balled, but his eyes flickered with something I had never seen before: doubt. My mother looked away, blinking rapidly. Pamela began to cry, though whether from guilt or fear of losing, I couldn't tell. And Jason, "A judge won't uphold this." Judge Henderson's voice rang out like a gavel. "On the contrary, Richard, this will is airtight. The evidence of competence is overwhelming. Any attempt to contest it would fail and expose every dirty secret in open court." My father froze. Jason muttered another curse. Pamela buried her face in her hands. And then the final twist. Matthew laid one last document on the table. Harold and Elizabeth not only left Natalie their fortune, they left her controlling interest in Alexander Logistics. Effective immediately, she is the legal stakeholder. Gasps echoed around the room. My father's face drained of color. "What?" "You heard me," Matthew said. "Natalie now holds the power you always craved. And unlike you, she's already demonstrated the values required to wield it." I looked at my family, these people who had tried to strip me bare, who had thrown me out with nothing, who had treated me as a pawn in their hunger for wealth. And I saw it in their eyes, the recognition that they had lost. Not just the money, not just the company, but the illusion of control, because the records didn't lie, and neither did I. When the last document landed on the table and the truth became undeniable, the room fractured. It wasn't loud at first, just a ripple of silence, like the moment after glass shatters, but before anyone reacts. Then it all came spilling out. Pamela was the first to break. She sobbed into her hands, shoulders shaking as she wailed, "They hated us. Our own parents hated us." Her husband, Stephen, reached for her arm, but she shook him off violently. "Don't touch me. You knew they favored her." Her tears were theatrical, but the panic in her voice was real. For the first time, she realized there was no performance that could rewrite what had been recorded in ink and video. Jason, on the other hand, exploded. He shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. "This is all a setup. You're all in on it." His voice cracked as he pointed at Rosa, at Matthew, even at the judge. "You coached them, you manipulated them. None of this is real." "Sit down, Jason," the judge said firmly. Jason's sunglasses clattered to the floor as his hands balled into fists. His bravado was crumbling, replaced by the desperation of a man who had lived on handouts his whole life. "I needed that money," he yelled, his voice breaking. I was supposed to build something, prove I was more than a joke. His words dissolved into a strange. You understand how this looks. You understand how unfair this is. We can still find a way to share. You don't have to cut us out. I stared at her. The woman who had once told me I was an obligation, who had never asked about my dreams, my fears, my joy, and now she dared to call me darling. I almost laughed. My father, though, he was different. He didn't cry like Pamela or beg like Jason. He sat still, shoulders rigid, jaw clenched, but his silence was louder than any scream. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, dangerous. You think this is over, he said. You think a pile of papers and some dusty old journals change who I am. I built my life without them, and I'll survive this too. But you, he leaned forward, eyes burning into mine. You'll regret this, Natalie. You'll regret standing against your own blood. For a moment, the little girl inside me, the one who had spent years chasing his approval, wanted to shrink back. But then I remembered his hand on my arm the night of the will reading, the way he hissed threats like a snake. I remembered being thrown out of my apartment with 30 minutes to pack. And I remembered every moment my grandparents had chosen love when he chose power. No, I said, my voice steady. I'll regret ever believing you were family. That struck him. I saw it in the flicker of his eyes, the twitch of his jaw. For once, he wasn't the man in control. The judge cleared his throat. Richard, I suggest you and your family leave before you say something you can't take back. The law is not on your side. The evidence is overwhelming. If you continue, all of this becomes public record. Pamela whimpered. Jason muttered curses. My mother's face went pale, but my father just stood, straightening his jacket as if nothing had touched him. This isn't the end, he said flatly, not by a long shot. He turned, motioning for the others to follow. One by one they left, their footsteps heavy on the polished floors. Jason shot me a final glare, eyes wet with rage. You'll be sorry, sis, he hissed. Pamela refused to look at me. My mother lingered for a moment at the door, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something softer, but she didn't. She walked out, spine stiff, head high, mask unbroken. And then the door closed. The silence that followed was deafening, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was liberating. Dorothy brought me a cup of coffee. Dorothy, the judge, the chief, a strange collection of allies, bound not by blood, but by loyalty, by respect, by love. And it hit me like a wave. Maybe blood wasn't family after all. Maybe family was the people who stood with you when the wolves came. When the dust finally settled, when the last of their cars disappeared down the long driveway, I stood at the window of my grandparents' home and let the silence sink in. It wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. It was the silence of a battlefield after the victors have remained standing. But victory didn't taste the way I thought it would. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't loud, it was heavy, like carrying a crown you never asked for. In the days that followed, the messages poured in. My father sent lawyers with threats thinly veiled as negotiations. Jason flooded my phone with texts, half insults, half desperate pleas for seed funding for his next doomed venture. Pamela left voicemails crying about how she couldn't sleep, how her children deserved better schools, how her parents had never understood her struggles. And my mother? She sent flowers. A dozen white roses with a note that read, "Family is forever. Don't turn your back on us." But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I finally understood. To engage with them was to let them keep feeding on me. To answer was to open the door they were pounding on. My grandparents had trusted me to protect their legacy, and that meant protecting myself from those who would destroy it. Instead, I turned my energy to what mattered. With Rosa's guidance, I took my seat as a stakeholder in Alexander Logistics. I didn't run the company, that wasn't my calling, but I sat in on meetings, asked questions, and made sure the values Harold and Elizabeth built it on were honored. Profit sharing stayed, retirement benefits stayed, every employee remained protected. They weren't just workers, they were the heartbeat of what my grandparents had created, and now I was their guardian. With Matthew's help, I launched the Elizabeth and Harold Foster Foundation, $10 million dedicated to education, to scholarships, to vocational training, to the children who might never have had a chance otherwise. The first year, 20 students received full rides to college. I attended the ceremony, shaking hands with nervous teenagers whose lives were changing in front of my eyes. One girl hugged me so tightly I almost cried. "No one in my family has ever gone to college," she whispered, "but now I can." That was when I felt it, the true meaning of legacy, not numbers on a bank statement, not square footage of a mansion, but impact, the ripples of kindness that outlive you. At Sunshine Elementary, I kept teaching. People couldn't believe it. Why would a millionaire stay in a classroom filled with finger paint and spelling tests? But the answer was simple. It wasn't about the salary. My meta, pause over for sex 0.05. The pride in their faces when they solved a math problem on their own. Money could never replace that. If anything, money gave me the freedom to make it better. Every child in my class had snacks, coats for winter, books that weren't falling apart. No one went without, not while I was there. And slowly, the house that once felt so empty began to feel alive again. Carlos kept the garden blooming. Dorothy cooked Sunday dinners just as my grandparents had always done. Friends, neighbors, and even former employees filled the rooms with laughter, with stories, with warmth. My family by blood had cast me out, but in their place I found a family by choice. Still, some nights, when the house was quiet and the lemon scent of my grandmother's polish lingered in the air, I thought about what I'd lost, about the moment my father hissed, "You regret this," about Jason's desperate eyes when he realized he was nothing without handouts, about my mother's trembling lips, so close to saying something real but locked behind pride, and Pamela's sobbing, not out of love, but out of fear of losing access. Sometimes, revenge is seeing them crumble. Sometimes, it's knowing they'll never get what they wanted. But real revenge, I learned, isn't about watching others fall. It's about rising higher than they ever believed you could. 6 months after the confrontation, I visited my grandparents' graves. I laid fresh flowers on the grass and sat on the bench nearby. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of leaves and earth. For a long time, I said nothing. Then, finally, I whispered, I'm trying my best. I hope I'm making you proud. In my heart, I felt the answer, not in words, but in memory, in Grandpa's booming laugh, in Grandma's soft hands guiding mine as I sewed a button, in their voices reminding me that money is just a tool, not a measure of worth. I left that cemetery lighter than I had entered because I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't just $26 million. It wasn't the house, or the company, or the foundation. It was the courage to stand alone. It was the strength to honor